It required Donald Trump's return to the White House for Europe to truly grasp the fragility of the American security umbrella. Yet, it was the current occupant who transformed that strategic ambiguity into a systemic shock, jolting those submerged in illusion awake to a harsh reality. They have been surviving on borrowed warmth. For decades, the old continent viewed itself as Washington's equal partner, but the truth, unveiled by President Trump, was far colder. Europe had become so habituated to cost-free security that it forgot the inevitable day of reckoning. Upon his reclamation of power, Brussels realized the unthinkable scenario had materialized. The United States no longer desired to be an unconditional protector. Trump offered no diplomatic pleasantries. From his opening salvos, the president sent a message as precise as a scalpel. Europe is no longer a strategic ally in the traditional sense, but rather a neighbor that has relied on others for too long while contributing too little. Unlike his predecessors, Trump eschewed the closed-door decorum where diplomacy salvages dignity. He spoke directly to the cameras, deliberately subjecting the EU to a global public audit. Then came the ultimatums on defense. The White House demanded NATO contributions at levels previously relegated to theoretical internal papers. Some European leaders learned of these demands through the American press before receiving official correspondence. But for Trump, this was merely a stress test. He sought to determine whether the EU possessed genuine resolve or was merely intoxicated by a delusion of its own power. Regarding Ukraine, the arena where Europe declared eternal solidarity with Kiev, President Trump needed only to intimate a reduction in aid to send tremors through the continent, exposing their acute awareness of their own limitations. Budgets can be hiked, but defense industrial bases cannot accelerate as quickly as political slogans. If Washington pivots, battlefield dynamics will shift in ways the EU dares not contemplate. The severest blow was not an official directive, but a strategic leak to the US press regarding Trump's call, reminding leaders that Washington's checkbook is not infinite. This intelligence surfaced in the media before the EU diplomatic corps could even verify it. It was a maneuver that inflicted not only diplomatic humiliation but also placed Europe under a harsh spotlight, forcing a justification for its decades of free riding. From this juncture, EU capitals understood the paradigm had shifted. This was no longer a traditional alliance. It was a transactional negotiation table where Trump dictated the terms, set the tempo, and forced Europe into a reactive posture, compelling acceptance regardless of their will. To comprehend how Trump has cornered Europe, one must examine the three vulnerabilities he has targeted: security, dependence, internal fragmentation, and geopolitical delusion. The first vulnerability, security, is the most lethal strike. Germany possesses a robust economy but an atrophied military. France holds a nuclear deterrent but a defense industry unable to sustain a war of attrition. Many others rely entirely on the American shield. When Trump declared that delinquent payers might be left to fend for themselves, the panic in Europe stemmed not from the threat itself, but from the existential danger it represented. For the first time in decades, the EU was forced to ask, if the US truly withdraws, how long can they survive? The second vulnerability, internal division, paralyzes the EU's response. National interests diverge sharply. Germany is tethered to the Chinese market. France pursues strategic autonomy. Poland views Russia as an existential threat, while Hungary and Italy prioritize nationalist agendas. Trump needed only to mention scaling back Ukraine aid to expose these fracture lines. When Europe wishes to object but fears abandonment, its collective voice is rendered impotent. Finally, there is the illusion of power. The EU once believed itself a pole in a multipolar order, a peer to Washington or Beijing, but the White House has torn down that curtain. Economic aggregate cannot substitute for hard power. Stern communiques cannot manufacture missiles, radar, or billion-dollar aid packages. The noose Trump has placed around Europe's neck appears to be tightening absent sufficient payment. While Europe reeled from these strategic shocks, Donald Trump opened a new encirclement operation, this time on the trade front. With his signature transactional directness, the president bypassed diplomatic protocol, broadcasting his message straight to the airwaves, forcing the old continent into the role of a passive audience. If his previous term stirred controversy with steel and aluminum tariffs, his current target is far more comprehensive, spanning EVs, supply chains, and the footprint of European firms in the US. Tariff warnings on electric vehicles have left German, Dutch, and French conglomerates in a state of high anxiety. Behind the emergency summits lies a tangible fear. If Washington tightens trade restrictions, key EU industries face direct impact. Market share will erode, supply chains will be coerced into relocating to the US to secure preferential treatment, and European goods risk expulsion from the world's largest consumer market. Brussels once prided itself on the transatlantic bond, but to Trump's pragmatic eye, that sentiment is a worn-out cloak. In reality, the White House has conflated security and commerce, placing Europe in a bind. To retain Washington's protection, the EU must sacrifice economic interests, but resisting US tariffs to protect trade risks, a reduction in strategic cover, a gamble no EU nation is willing to take, while Ukraine remains an active war zone. This is the paradox constraining Europe. They desire both American protection and economic sovereignty, but Trump has exposed the binary truth. The EU cannot straddle two boats simultaneously. Many commentators believe President Trump diagnosed this weakness long ago. Possessing a businessman's calculus, he rejects vague commitments or ambiguous alliance values. He poses specific questions. Who pays? Who benefits? Who is the dependent? When these three metrics are tabled, the image of the EU, once an equal partner, morphs into that of a debtor friend with dubious solvency. In response, Europe has launched firefighting measures, calls for defense spending hikes, proposals for a common defense fund, and pushes for energy independence. Yet, every solution collides with familiar obstacles: bureaucratic inertia, internal discord, and asymmetrical interests. Many in the EU ask, why does a resource-rich alliance move slower than the executive fiat of the White House? The answer lies in a chronic structural weakness. The EU is an economic giant, but a strategic dwarf, lacking decision-making velocity. It is weak precisely where Trump attacks. Meanwhile, the US president exploits every moment to pull Europe into Washington's orbit. By forcing Brussels to prove its capabilities, the White House is invisibly eroding the EU's leverage at the negotiating table. Scholars argue Trump's strategy is not impulsive, but a calculated long game to force a European capability upgrade, but via a roadmap where the US writes the rules. The Ukraine narrative further illuminates the continent's limitations. When Washington signaled that Kiev should seek a de-escalation path, EU capitals were instantly rendered passive. They aspire to leadership but lack the decisive cards, from artillery production capacity to logistics. Analysts liken the EU to a lender promising an umbrella during a storm, only to discover it leaks upon opening. Digging deeper, every Trump maneuver exposes the EU's internal contradictions. Some nations seek alignment with the US, others cling to strategic independence, while some prioritize national over collective interest. Brussels attempts to synthesize 27 viewpoints into a unified message, but the effort only highlights the dissonance. The situation resembles an orchestra preaching harmony, yet the drums beat one rhythm while the horns play another. Amidst this, domestic political ramifications are unavoidable. European voters demand stable energy, reduced defense outlays, and de-escalation in Ukraine. Trump holds the advantage here. He is willing to articulate truths allies dislike and assume political risks EU leaders dare not bear. This constantly tilts the balance of power toward the White House. From this, an existential question emerges. Does Europe possess the foundation for true independence, or is it destined to remain in America's orbit regardless of its will? Analysts suggest the EU overestimated its self-defense capabilities and underestimated the velocity of strategic change. For a decade, they chanted strategic autonomy, but Trump's return revealed the slogan's fragility. And while debates on security, energy, Ukraine, and trade remained unresolved, President Trump proposed a comprehensive renegotiation of US-EU relations. Officials admit this alarms them more than the NATO issue. If Washington constricts markets, embraces protectionism, or forces supply chain reshoring, The EU economy, already battered by successive shocks, could face crushing pressure. All this leads to a pragmatic conclusion. Trump is not weakening the EU, he is merely illuminating pre-existing fractures. The question for the EU is no longer whether they are cornered that has already occurred. The real question is, does Europe possess the courage to reform now that the truth is laid bare? If not, they face an era of long-term strategic subservience, a phase not imposed by Washington, but created by Brussels when it chose comfort over preparation, prestige over hard capability. That is the paradox Donald Trump, intentionally or otherwise, is forcing Europe to confront. That concludes this report. If you have a specific topic you'd like us to cover, please leave a comment below.